Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines, and in this programme that is due to be aired on Wednesday the 18th of January, we will be asking, is the Iranian regime stepping up its terrorist attacks against Britain and the West? As it was reported last week, but not widely, that security forces discovered uranium at Heathrow airport that was destined for Iranian nationals in this country to either carry out a nuclear dirty bomb attack or a possible assassination using uranium or nuclear materials on this soil. But also we've seen in the past week that an Iranian British national that was close to the regime was executed by the regime as well, which has then provoked a kind of furious backlash in terms of British-Iranian relations. So we'll be asking in this programme, is the Iranian regime now stepping up its terror attacks against Britain and the West? Reagan, it's great to be doing Behind Headlines with you, and particularly I've been ill for the past 3 weeks, so it's great to do for me, my first Behind Headlines of 2023.
It's great to be here, Simon, and what a story to kick off this year with. Of course, viewers will be well acquainted with the times that we've covered the situation as pertains to Iran, both on Behind the Headlines and also briefly on our mornings. And it's a live issue. It won't go away because they are at the moment a part of this kind of axis of powerhouses which are a threat to global security. Absolutely.
And of course, if we simplify this, the enemies of Israel are also the enemies of the West. And if you have a nation like the Islamic Republic of Iran that's been in power since the Islamic Revolution in '79, its whole intention is to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, but also to bring about the return of the 12th Imam or the Mahdi and to establish a world global government led by Tehran and the 12th Imam, or its Shia messianic figure. It's time really that the West really woke up and realised that we can't negotiate with these people. We can't negotiate with them over their nuclear weapons program. And now this horrific news story that the Iranian government was actually involved in flying uranium to Heathrow airport which was picked up by some of the news channels, but we didn't see it on our mainstream media whatsoever, but it was in the newspapers, means that the Iranian regime is escalating its attacks against the UK.
Iran is, as a state, one of the biggest sponsors of terror around the globe and actively is investing funds in Islamic terror groups, primarily those that are well known for their assault on Israel. But this is yet another evidence of intrusion into, away from Israel, but on the West. It's led people, we've seen rumblings of this for the past year, to begin suggesting and calling for the Revolutionary Guard to be labeled a terror organization. And the question I have in response to that is, what's taken so long? Why is it not already labeled a terror organization, as it actively has suppressed human freedoms and rights across Iran? It actively is involving itself in not only the sponsorship of terror, but in supplying the resources to commit acts of terror, and particularly, and perhaps it's to avoid stoking up fear, perhaps it's to avoid widespread panic and the potential for suspicion or racial attacks or something. Who knows why? But this story of the uranium being discovered at Heathrow Airport has barely been covered. We did see the British national Alireza Akbari, who's an Iranian as well, accused of spying. We saw that he was executed. He promoted the Foreign Secretary James Cleverly to withdraw temporarily of the British ambassador in Tehran. We've seen that's what's happened as a result. Growing calls now have been made in the aftermath, as we just said, to prescribe the Iranian Revolutionary Guards as a terror organization. I believe Tony Blair's think tank group has already done that.
Yeah, and I think there's growing calls in Parliament to actually classify the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps and also the Al-Quds Force as a prescribed terrorist organization. I think the Trump administration did that when Trump was in power, but it's absolutely ridiculous knowing that they command the biggest global terror network in the world and they're not classified as a terrorist organization. But I think we also have to put these things in context. I mean, for example, the Iranian regime has been rocked by almost 4 months of unprecedented protests led by these brave and courageous women in Iran against the regime itself. And so therefore what we're seeing now is a clampdown on behalf of the Iranian regime internally, and also fearing that might not have long left, it is then heavily pushing forward with support for kind of global terrorism, and we'll expand upon that as its impact on the UK and the rest of Europe as well. Is certainly stepping up its terrorist activities. But you know, to understand what's going on, we really need to know what's happening internally in Iran. Now, there's a very good article published by the Gatestone Institute, and this is by Amir Tahari, who writes this one: Iran, protests and paralysis. Said almost for 4 months after the current popular uprising against the Islamic Republic started in Iran, 3 things are clear. The first is that even if the uprising hits an interlude to recuperate, as is often the case with such movements, it's unlikely to simply fade away. Said it has immobilized energies that cannot be tamed with time, and raise such hopes and expectations that even the most hard-boiled cynics in power won't be able to disregard. And it says there, next, most of those who have mobilized those energies, that is to say the thousands of young men and women who risk all to openly challenge one of the most brutal regimes in contemporary history, while knowing that what they want and don't know how to translate their ideas into a cold political reality of securing and using power. And I'll just finish with this one. And the third thing that seems clear to me is that the Khomeinist establishment is stuck by a paralysis in decision making that prevents it from even suggesting a way out of the historical impasse that has led Iran into it. So we really see, don't we, that the God is really shaking the Iranian regime, and despite its kind of pursuit of nuclear weapons, sponsorship of international terrorism around the world, its threats against Israel, but also combined with its horrific human rights abuses, and despite the fact that the Biden administration has tried to reach out to this regime, knowing that they're also in the crosshairs because they're supplying Putin with drones, military drones that are killing innocent civilians in the Ukraine. So we see that Iran now, with this alliance with Russia, is a direct threat to European and British security.
Absolutely. A lot of people may have thought, well, this could die down, the protest will die down because the regime in Iran removed and suspended the morality police that were responsible for the death of this young Iranian Kurdish woman who they deemed to not be wearing her hijab correctly. So, you know, they suspended that group. In practice, what that looks like, it could mean absolutely nothing in practice because the rules are still going to remain the same. Yeah. But you can do that. You can say, okay, we're not going to have the morality police anymore. It doesn't change the fact that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard has been responsible for, and this is an extremely conservative estimate, between 300 and 500 civilian deaths. I say a very conservative estimate. I have seen some figures that have gone over 1,000 in regards to deaths, and there have been 15,000 jailed during these protests. So it's no longer just about one death. We're now dealing with at least 300 to 500 deaths. I think more likely approaching 1,000 deaths and that means 1,000 families made up of different people who have friends as well. And so we could actually be seeing something extremely dramatic should everyone continue to band together. We could actually see the seed for the overthrow of this evil regime.
I think this is why this regime is getting desperate, because that's exactly the case. I mean, also according to Sunday's Sunday Telegraph editorial, they said that human rights groups say that at least 341 protesters were killed by the regime, including 52 children, and those arrested on charges of enmity against God or corruption on earth face unfair trials, swift executions, including hanging from cranes, and torture is rife. And he says when you break down those figures, a curious pattern emerges that almost 60% of those deaths happen in just 9 cities in 2 provinces, Sistan and Baluchistan, as well as Kurdistan. Now we have an excellent CBN News report that looks at the latest developments in terms of the mass protests that are rocking the Iranian regime in January 2023.
The newest victims, 22-year-old Mohammad Mehdi Karami and Mohammad Hosseini, were sent to death by the Islamic regime. Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei called for authorities to address ongoing nationwide protests in a stern and fair manner. He also repeated an allegation that foreign powers had prompted the unrest without providing evidence. The remarks by Khamenei could embolden authorities to continue the harsh punishment of detainees. At least 4 young men have been executed since the demonstration began, following internationally criticized rapid show trials. Germany's foreign minister accusing the regime of suppressing its people, warning that Iranian oppression and terrorizing of the population will have consequences. Meanwhile, Israel's prime minister during a cabinet meeting highlighting the regime's ongoing brutality.
We salute the Iranian citizens fighting heroically for their freedom. They are sacrificing their lives for basic civil rights. They are exposing for the whole world the true and ugly face of the oppressive regime in Tehran, a regime that threatens its citizens, the countries of the region, and the entire world.
Iran's Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi urges Western countries to take a firmer stand against Tehran. Writing democratic countries should expel regime's ambassadors and recall their ambassadors. They should follow the parallel path of maximum pressure on the regime and maximum support for the Iranian people. The UK, the United States, France, and Germany must officially stop trying to revive Iran nuclear deal. Here in the U.S., former State Department spokesperson Morgan Ortega's warning the situation could get even worse. Remembering the regime in the 1980s murdered thousands of opponents and buried them in nameless mass graves. Ortega is urging, among other things, that countries worldwide should recall their ambassadors from Iran and offer to return to the Iran deal, return all UN sanctions, and ban Iranian officials from foreign travel. Meanwhile, the protests continue, with Iranians holding massive rallies worldwide in support of the ongoing uprising inside the country. It began in September following the death of 16-year-old Mahsa Amini while she was in police custody for not wearing her headscarf properly. Myra Yazdari, CBN News.
And indeed, just around the corner from where I live, one to the north and one to the south, there are regular displays of banners, flags, and news articles. And there's even someone semi-permanently camped out with a tent in one spot, trying to highlight the plight of the Iranian people.
Which is important. And while we do see Iranian dissidents in the UK, and if they're wearing their kind of freedom for Iran t-shirts, I just need to go up to them, encourage them, and say that we're standing with you, and you know, we need to really step up our prayers for this situation. Now, Reagan, do you want to tell us about this extraordinary story? I mean, I was ill last week, but I mean, there was only so much I could actually take in, and then suddenly I came across this extraordinary article that was first published in the in the political magazine called The Week as their top story. I think the Sun newspaper covered it very well, but it certainly wasn't on our mainstream media.
Barely
the
covered.
fact that uranium
Yeah.
was discovered at Heathrow Airport back in December, the end of December, and was destined for Iranian nationals to either carry out a dirty nuclear bomb attack or assassination attack. Absolutely horrific.
Yeah, now the undeclared nuclear material did originate not from Iran but from Pakistan and arrived in the hold of a passenger flight from Oman, according to reports, but was destined for Iranian nationals. So it's interesting, you do kind of see a convergence of three states which are known to have terror links and sponsorship of terrorism kind of rife in their societies, involved in there, both Iran, Pakistan and Oman. The package was detected mercifully by scanners at the London airport and contained very potentially lethal amounts of uranium, of course depending on how it was intended to be used. Highly suspicious, was transferred to a freight shed in the process, triggering alarms and then causing security personnel to converge on the scene, isolating the unregistered shipment in a dedicated radioactive room. And police reportedly honed in on an Iran-based firm with premises in the United Kingdom where the uranium was destined for unidentified Iranians.
And of course now the latest news is that police have detained some Iranian nationals, I think in Cheshire,
right.
That they're watching and monitoring very carefully. But we also have to put the story in context. So the news story of this broke on the 11th of January, which wasn't covered widely by mainstream media. Certainly our TV anchors didn't pick it up. But the actual incident occurred on the 29th of January back in 2020.
December, yeah, 29th of December.
Oh, sorry, 29th of December, absolutely.
Yeah, so these things take time to report, to be discovered and found out. And I think wisely there's, to some degree, trying to decipher the different elements of what's going on before it finds its way out. There's no good in creating mass panic. At the same time, viewers do need to be aware that the suspicion is very much that it could have been destined to be built, to be used in building a dirty bomb, which is essentially an improvised nuclear device, homemade type explosive, which could cause mass havoc and loss of life. The package was suspected of being smuggled to UK-based Iranian nationals and arrived in the hold of just your standard passenger jet, as we said, originating in Pakistan via Oman. Specialist scanners which detected the lethal, potentially lethal uranium triggered those alarms, and the Sun newspaper would eventually report that there were real concerns in regard to the Iranians living here and what they wanted with the non-disclosed nuclear material. And certainly it seems that as it was traced to a particular Iranian firm, what is this firm? What is its purpose? What is its involvement? What is its research? What have its historic activities been? Is this some sort of sleeper cell like group or organization? These are valid concerns, and the security forces are going to be looking into.
No, absolutely. And also, I mean, I was involved in U.S. Secretary of State Chertov's press briefings back in 2008 when he was the Secretary for Homeland Security under George W. Bush. We managed to get it televised, his speech on BBC Parliament. And he was warning back then of the dangers of a dirty bomb. And the fact is that the Iranian regime, according to the outgoing the Chief of Staff of the IDF, believe that the Iranians possibly have up to 7 nuclear weapons now. And this is before the regime has actually gone into nuclear breakout, that they are already involved in kind of nuclear terrorism. So just imagine what it would be like if they got their hands on nuclear weapons. which means that the likelihood of a dirty nuclear bomb going off in London or Manchester or Paris or Rome or New York or Washington, DC is a very dangerous and chilling reality. And on the one hand, you can understand why our security services have kept this low key, and maybe our mainstream media haven't picked this up. But I think there's a sense of duty that the British public need to be told about the threat posed by the Islamic Republic of Iran to our nation. And this, I think, is a declaration of war. To actually try and smuggle in uranium into the country should be a declaration of war. And our country and our government need to wake up to the fact that we are at war with the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's not of our choosing. They chose to go to war against us. And so we really need to see our government step up its Iranian activities against the Iranian government, not against the Iranian people. Support the Iranian people, but do everything they can to try and bring this evil regime down. Otherwise, we could have a nuclear explosion go off in one of our major cities. And thankfully, due to the excellent security services at Heathrow Airport, our brilliant intelligence, prevented a horrific maybe dirty bomb attack or a Lefienko-style assassination plot. And of course, we saw the horrible and horrific Salisbury poisonings that occurred a few years ago in Salisbury by Putin. So this should be a kind of wake-up call for our nation as well as our government.
Yeah, officials do believe that they prevented an immediate threat to the public. So there does seem to be evidence that this did have some sort of malevolent purpose to it. They have assured that strict protocols are being followed, and that strict protocols to fly dangerous cargo, particularly on passenger flights, must always be followed. Commander Richard Smith, head of the Met's SO-15 counter-terror branch, said, "I want to reassure the public that the amount of contaminated material was extremely small and has been assessed by experts as posing no threat to the public," which seems to contradict other reports. So they're wanting to minimize what's going on. You understand that. But at the same time, other officials are saying, no, we do believe we have prevented some sort of event from happening. Of course, there needs to be a balance between making sure that the public feels safe and protected, whilst at the same time making them aware of legitimate threats and maintaining honesty. Although our investigation remains ongoing, from our inquiry so far, it does not appear to be linked to any direct threat. Richard Smith insists, as the public would expect, however, we will continue to follow up on all available lines of inquiry to ensure this is definitely the case. So there seems to be some discrepancy between various security forces and in the reporting of this. One can understand the need to ensure people feel safe and secure. Our economy has already been blistered enough in the past few years to cause people to sequester themselves indoors due to the fear of nuclear attack in some way. So that they're wanting to keep this all in perspective, and that's understandable. But Britain does need to be aware and does need to wake up to the reality that Iran as a state is the leading backer of terror organizations around the world. But Simon, you seem to be indicating, okay, this is a declaration of war. I think that's given to some degree. What practically do you believe we should be doing?
Well, I mean, cleverly, our Foreign Secretary, his only temporary withdrawal. Our ambassador to Tehran, and probably within a few weeks he'll be back in his position. So firstly, we need to cut all diplomatic relations off with our country, with Iran. We need to kick the Iranian ambassador and the whole diplomatic staff and also members of probably the RGC out of this country. And they need to be kicked out. We've got to say that we will not enter into the Iranian nuclear agreement. We can't allow this Iranian regime to acquire nuclear weapons. We need to increase sanctions, particularly targeting the regime. The first thing the government can also do is classify the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps as a terrorist organization, as well as the Al-Quds force. We've got to stop them operating in the UK. And we've got to send a very clear message to the regime in Tehran that you cannot send uranium to our country without serious repercussions. And also we've got to put into the mix as well, it is the fact that Iran is posing a direct threat to European and British security by supplying military drones to Russia in Russia's war against Ukrainians, which is on European soil. So this is a major escalation of Iran's terrorism influence and terrorism capabilities on the continent of Europe and Britain as well. So firstly, we've got to recognise that this is evil. This is a malign, vile government and is an enemy of Israel. And therefore, if it's an enemy of Israel, it's an enemy of the West.
And I want to reiterate here, we occasionally have encountered on Revolution TV, on various live programs, a lot of support, bizarre as it may seem, for Russia and its actions in Ukraine. If you are supporting Russia, you're supporting Iran.
Exactly.
The two are like, they're tied. At the hip. Russia and Iran are teaming up with each other in this ongoing deliberation for a nuclear deal with the U.S. Russia and Iran are like that, tied at the hip. So please, viewers, be aware and be discerning in that regard. Iran is a terror threat. They are expanding. Remember Al-Qaeda? It feels like a long time since we've seen the name Al-Qaeda and had any thought of its impact or any thought of its reach. ISIS has been the biggest threat in terms of Islamic terror in recent days, and of course the Taliban in Afghanistan last year took over the news and took back Afghanistan in harrowing scenes. But Al-Qaeda is growing once more, and Iran is its primary backer. And so it's not only a threat to Europe and the UK, we're also seeing that it has significant meaning for the US, as Al-Qaeda once more, with the aid of Iran, is expanding its terror network. We have this report from our friends at CBN.
One might not expect that the world's leading state-sponsored terrorism that's a Shia revolutionary regime would partner with a Sunni terrorist group. These are oil and water, you might think. But in actuality, there is a very close relationship between these two.
Iran's connection to al-Qaeda dates back to the early 1990s, when the Islamic Revolutionary Guard helped Osama bin Laden run jihadist training camps in Sudan. The regime also offered safe haven to al-Qaeda leadership fleeing Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11. Saif al-Adil, a face on the FBI's first list of most wanted terrorists, was among those protected.
Saif al-Adil is next in line to be leader of al-Qaeda. He's the crown prince of al-Qaeda, if you will. Now, there's no guarantee that al-Qaeda leadership is actually going to tap him, but that's the smart bet. And Saif al-Adil has been living the al-Qaeda life in Iran for many years.
There's concern Iran will now seek to take advantage of that relationship, bringing al-Qaeda into the fold as another proxy to do the regime's dirty work.
Al-Qaeda and Iran have common enemies. They both hate the United States. They both hate Israel. They both hate Saudi Arabia and the other Sunni Gulf monarchies. If al-Qaeda is mounting terrorist attacks against all or any of those organizations, that advances Iran's strategic objectives, and it does so in a way that's deniable.
Nathan Sales, former ambassador at large and coordinator for counterterrorism under the Trump administration, says the wild card in how this will all play out is Afghanistan.
Now that the Taliban is back in business of providing safe haven to senior al-Qaeda figures, as we saw with Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was living in the heart of downtown Kabul, presumably under Taliban protection, does that mean that other al-Qaeda leaders likewise are going to relocate themselves and their families into the safe haven of Afghanistan under Taliban control?
If that happens, Sales tells CBN News it could change the relationship between al-Qaeda and Iran. Other experts warn it could also result in a sort of three-way unholy alliance.
They're not identical ideologically. They come from very distinct backgrounds. but they're willing to put their differences aside when it comes to their hatred towards the West broadly and America specifically.
Gabriel Nerona, former Iran advisor for the State Department, says no matter how this plays out, the U.S. needs a proactive approach.
I think we have to really up our counterterrorism strike capability. We need to work with local partners, have intelligence on the ground so we can identify these threats and take them out early. And then I think the big thing is money. Money is the sinews of war. If you don't have money, you can't do a whole lot. I think we need to get a lot more serious about our sanctions.
Excellent report there put together by our friends at CBN. It's also interesting to note that the Iranian regime, through its branch Hezbollah operations overseas, collaborated with Al-Qaeda and bin Laden in the 1990s and formed the world's most dangerous and largest terror network between the Iranian regime and Al-Qaeda as well. And we also saw that they birthed Al-Qaeda in Iraq after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And Iran's terror networks go deep in the Middle East, deep into Africa, deep into Europe, and into North America, and also into Central America as well. So to show that the Iranian regime is stepping up its terrorist activities, not only here in Britain, but also in Europe, we have a whole list of terrorist activities carried out by the regime on European soil over the last few decades. So we see here, for example, Reagan, that the regime has also carried out major terrorist operations in the West, including the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Belgium and Italy. 2 Iranian nationals were held just last week over a terror plot to use cyanide and ricin in Germany. And in 2021, an Iranian diplomat was convicted in Belgium for being part of a terrorist plot to blow up an event hosted by dissident groups in Paris. And the conference was also attended by 5 British MPs who would have been murdered had that plot taken place. And we also see that these are overseen by the military group known as the Quds Force, which is watched over the powerful and fanatic Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps.
They were, a reminder, once headed by General Hossein Soleimani before he was assassinated by the U.S. That was in 2020. We did a report on that at the time. These reports directly to the supreme leader of fundamentalist regime, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. So this is, has been an ongoing issue. The Quds Force clearly involved in acts of terror around the globe. It's estimated that the force is up to 20,000 strong, understood to be responsible for supporting and training other proxy groups worldwide. A list of Iranian terror activities in Britain and Europe. They were, of course, as we've been discussing on the basis of this program, responsible, linked to the uranium found at Heathrow back in December of 2022. But let's rewind the clock all the way to April of 1990, where in Switzerland, an Iranian professor was gunned down in a car. In 1993, in Italy, a brutal murder of an opposition activist. In June 2018, in France, a plot to bomb a dissident rally, including MPs and attendants, which you just mentioned. June 1985, Greece, Iran-linked plane heading
hijacked
for Athens was hijacked, exactly. February 1996, Turkey, 2 Iranian dissidents were murdered. February of 2021, Belgium, Iranian diplomat is convicted of terrorism. October of 2018, in Denmark, Iran plans to kill an opposition leader. 2023 already, Germany, 2 Iranians arrested, suspected of this cyanide ricin plot that you just mentioned. In December, in Sweden, 2 Iranian suspected terrorists were deported. 2012, Bulgaria, Iranian suicide bomber murdered 5 Israelis and the bus driver on a bus and injured 32 Israelis. So opposition activists have understandably warned The Sun online that Westerners are increasingly becoming the target of the Iranian regime, and they're expanding their outreach, they're expanding their output, and desperately trying to cling on to some measure of power, meanwhile in Iran, while under extreme duress by these protests, and are fighting wounded at the moment.
We also saw that last year, and we did a Behind the Headlines program on this year, that the head of MI5, Ken McCallum, named Iran as a major security threat to the UK. He said there were 10 foiled plots to kidnap or kill people in Britain in 2022. And he said in the aftermath of the Iranian 1979 revolution, the new regime gradually learned to develop a strategy of hostage taking and terrorism to achieve one goal, spreading warfare abroad to preserve an illegitimate rule at home. The report notes that there is hardly any major European country Iran has either attacked nor established a base. And it talks about how it points out that Iran has used non-Iranians, especially Arab proxy militants, to attack foreign targets. So, you know, we were talking about earlier before. I mean, I think what we're seeing, Reagan, is an escalation in terrorist activities on behalf of the Iranian regime. And it's absolutely crazy that our government has not banned the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, as a terrorist organisation in the UK, and particularly when we're dealing with this kind of Iranian shipment into the UK, destined for Iranian nationals to potentially carry out a terrorist attack in this country. We're not dealing with Semtex, we're not dealing with dynamite, we're not dealing with any other kind of plastic explosives here. We're dealing with the most deadliest substance known to man, which is uranium, or kind of nuclear weapons. They're not so much nuclear weapons, but that could be made into a bomb and carried out as a nuclear attack that could contaminate, you know, an entire city centre. And so therefore, I think what we're dealing with here is the Iranian regime escalating its terrorist activities, whilst Britain and the West were trying desperately to seek an Iranian nuclear agreement over Iran's nuclear weapons program, which has a sunsets clause, which only will allow a certain amount of time before the regime actually has nuclear weapons and reaches nuclear breakout. And we're giving them billions in sanctions relief, hoping that by negotiating with them, by appeasing them, by giving them billions of our own taxpayers' money, that this will somehow pacify them. And we know that this is not pacifying. They're stepping up their terrorist activities against Israel. They're stepping up their terrorist activities here in Europe and against Britain. And of course, are now the main arms supplier behind Putin's war against the Ukrainian people.
Yeah, I'm seeing in the past, you know, in history, and there's that statement, of course, that those who don't study history, they're doomed to repeat it. The scene of Neville Chamberlain waving that scrap of paper in the air, talking about peace for our time, having signed this policy of appeasement. And the problem is you cannot trust evil organizations. You can't trust evil individuals that have proven themselves to be dishonest. You can't trust evil organizations that have proven to be dishonest. You cannot trust evil nations that are acting with impunity, that are acting with such hate even towards their own people. Right, so it's beyond me how we're having this discussion of, let's try to come to a nuclear deal, let's try to come to some friendly arrangement, when we're dealing with two states that have shown themselves to behave in evil, treacherous ways, not just against those that they consider enemy nations, but against their very own flesh and blood. Yeah. And so it's incredibly jarring to witness. I mean, we have seen in the aftermath, of course, the 29th of December was when they first discovered this uranium at Heathrow Airport, reported on the 11th of January, but in even more recent days, in the news, more widely covered, was this execution of the Iranian British national, Alireza Akbari, detained by the Iranian regime, tortured for weeks to make a confession that he was a spy, and only a few days ago, as I said, was executed. Yeah. He'd been living in the UK for over a decade. Akbari, 61 years of age, was the former Deputy Defense Minister in the reformist government of Mohammad Khatami, who was arrested by the regime in 2019 after he was given a state-sanctioned visit believed to be at the behest of his former boss, Ali Shamkhani, who now serves as the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Council. He was due to hold talks with government officials on the nuclear deal, but was instead detained and tortured by security officials, according to Sunday Times, for more than 3,500 hours over a period of 10 months. It's just continuous. Last Wednesday, the British government demanded that Tehran should halt his execution. And what did we expect from that, Simon? I don't really know what we keep requests. We make these polite requests of don't execute him. What don't please don't kill him. And then what did they do? They hung him on Sunday.
But also, he was he's been living here in the UK for the last 10 years. He was part of Khatami's government, reformist government, but he was still part of the regime. We seem to kind of
just
forget
turn a
this
blind
one
eye
as well.
to these
He was just still part of the regime, obviously a slightly more moderate, if you can say that, under President Khatami, wanting kind of reforms, but still the supreme leader of Iran, Khomeini, holds total power and total control of the nation. Even if you have a slightly more moderate president, there's not a lot that he can actually do. And so therefore they tortured him, believing that he was the one that was selling Iran's nuclear stories, working with British intelligence on Iran's nuclear weapons program, and executed. So the fact is that, I think he was foolish in himself, thinking that he could actually go back to Iran and not face major problems. But the fact is that he was still very much tied to this regime under President Khatami. So it's not like he was a monarchist. It wasn't like he was a kind of opposition figure in the Iranian regime. And then obviously he was valuable to the British government, clearly. But the fact is that they ignored the British government's request and actually executed him last Saturday after pleas indicates that this regime is wanting to clamp down on internal opposition. But also let's not forget that the Israeli security forces have raided tons and tons and tons of material relating to Iran's nuclear facilities. There have been clandestine operations against Iran's nuclear facilities, the assassination of nuclear scientists in Iran as well. And that can only happen when you have elements within the regime that are working with security forces and telling them exactly what's going on. So, it's that human to intelligence. So we know that the regime is actually petrified.
Well, and yet we still see the U.S. wanting to finalize a deal, and Iran wants to finalize a deal as well. So we have this report on that nuclear deal from our friends at CBN.
The Iranian government says it's ready to wrap up a new nuclear deal. But can an agreement be reached? Should an agreement be reached? Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov warns of dangerous consequences if negotiations fail. He predicts without an accord, Middle East nations are at risk of engaging in an irreversible arms race. Well, joining us with more is Middle East Forum Director Greg Roman. So, Greg, what's the hang-up at this time? What's preventing the U.S., Europe, and Iran from reaching a new joint comprehensive plan of action?
I think that this is a case of Europe and the United States finally realizing that the emperor has no clothes in Iran, especially since the Russians are now relying upon Iranian exports of drones and missile technology to hit at the joint European-funded front in Ukraine, and also realizing that they have no intention of helping the Iranians get a diplomatic or any policy win so long as their own people are calling for the overthrow of their government. The reason why I think the Russians are doubling down now is because they need a new front to try to engage Europe and the United States on, as Ukraine is not going very well for them. And they also owe their Iranian allies a little bit of a payback for what Iran has done to help the Russians try to bolster their forces in Ukraine. So if Russia and Iran are able to get back to the table, the Americans and Europeans realize that it's a loss for Europe and America if they are to acquiesce to what Iran is doing right now with Russia and Europe.
Yeah, this seems like a new equation here, because I remember George Bush used to refer to it as the axis of evil, including Iran, North Korea, and so forth. Now you've got Russia in there with Iran. What are the implications of that?
Well, look at Russia's involvement with Iran's nuclear program, first and foremost. They've funded the building of Bushehr, Iran's first nuclear reactor. They've also sent Russian technology to help with some of Iran's other nuclear uranium enrichment and other centrifuge technologies. And now it's in Russia's interest to try to keep Iran close and to help them with whatever their policy needs are, because Russia's been shut off by most of the world, including even China to a certain extent, with their ability to import technology from Beijing. So Russia wants to give Iran a pass as it relates to their nuclear technology. And they're trying to rattle the saber of Iranian arms munitions production, which will threaten other Middle Eastern countries, even though it's Russia who's paying for Iran to be able to manufacture drones and missiles, which right now are being used against Ukraine, but could ostensibly be used against Israel, Turkey, and other American Gulf allies tomorrow. So Russia's playing a double game. I think America and Europe have realized this, and they're not going to move the line towards a nuclear deal so long as Iran continues its belligerent behavior in the Middle East and continues to support Russia's offensive war against Ukraine.
I'm sure many of those, even in Israel, who favor a new agreement, say Israel would benefit because the development of the Iranian nuclear program would be slowed, monitored by the UN. What do you say?
I think Iran's most dramatic gains in its nuclear program were when it was a signatory to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Its ability to increase the building of infrastructure in areas like Isfahan and Shiraz, where there's uranium enrichment taking place, its ability to build its nuclear program in terms of the military capability, which was revealed by the Mossad in a daring raid where the Israeli intelligence agency was able to steal Iran's entire nuclear archive, demonstrably showing that progress on its military aspects did not stop when it signed its deal. So there may be those in favor of slowing down the Iranian nuclear project, but the offset to that is an increase in Iran's ability to, number one, first and foremost, wage war against its own citizens by having more monies come in that it can use to militarize populations that still support the regime. And number two, outside of Iran's borders, we saw an uptick in Iranian attacks against American allies in Iraq, its funding of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and its ability to bolster the Assad regime in Syria. So I think that you can have both a slowdown in the Iran nuclear project and the ability to stop funding Iranian terrorism by getting tougher with Iran and making sure that there's more demonstrable consequences leading up into a military strike against its nuclear facilities by pursuing other policy options, like supporting the revolution or by clamping down with more economic sanctions against Tehran.
Do you think we're seeing the beginning of the end of the Islamic regime, or is greater oppression coming?
I think you have the nucleus of what could be the beginning of the end of the Islamic regime in Iran, but it will be for naught if the protesters are not able to coalesce around common leadership. The one missing ingredient right now in these 90 to 120 days of protest, depending on where you have your starting point, is that there is no true leadership which is exhibited, them standing up to be the face of this revolution. And you can't have a faceless revolution because eventually it'll allow the current political elements to manipulate perhaps the overthrow of the Ayatollah, but with the replacement of someone who will continue their draconian policies towards their citizens, which is how they got here in the first place.
Well, on to Israel. It may not be smooth sailing for the newly formed government there. What's the biggest challenge facing Bibi Netanyahu at this time?
Well, there's two. The first is between the core members and backbenchers of his Likud party, who I would call your traditional conservative, lowercase liberals. I think you also have the second challenge, which is between Netanyahu and Jewish diaspora communities around the world, who in a joint letter from the Jewish Agency, the World Zionist Organization, and other diaspora representative bodies called for Israel to maintain its pluralistic characters and its Zionist upbringing. And then on the other hand, you had, as a result of this letter, the leader of one of the opposition parties in the Knesset say that this was the end of Zionism in the Knesset as it was known because of Bibi's new government. I think it's a lot of semantics. I think it's a lot of polemics. But I think at the end of the day, Netanyahu is going to have to walk a fine line between his own party and the Jewish diaspora, and then to meet the needs of his coalition partners in order to keep a stable government.
Well, it's quite a balancing act for him, isn't it? Greg Roman, Middle East Forum Director, thank you for sharing your time and insights. We appreciate it, Greg.
Thank you.
And thank you, Gary Lane, for the excellent news report that you put together. It does also mean that Israel is very much in the crosshairs of the Iranian regime and is stepping up its terrorist activities in Judea and Samaria and the Palestinian territories in order to carry out potential terrorist attacks against Israel. Now, we have to understand that really now, as this program has been almost a kind of declaration of war on behalf of the Iranian regime, on this country, and the Iranian regime is stepping up its terrorist activities against the United Kingdom. What do you think how has the British government responded to this new escalation of terror threats, and also to the execution of Akbari, who was an Iranian British dissident?
Well, as we've already said, there have been mixed reports and mixed messages regarding the discovery of this uranium. In regard to the execution, there has been widespread condemnation. Unsurprisingly, Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister, said that it was callous, it was cowardly, and spoke of the Iranian regime as barbaric, with no respect for the human rights of their own people. Certainly, I think that sort of rhetoric could have been used a lot more over the past 4 months. There has been widespread condemnation, but what are words at the end of the day to a regime that has such power over its people and that is of such danger to the world? These words mean nothing to them. There's no conscience. One thing that we have to remember is that we're dealing not just with a nation, we're dealing with a whole religious ideology. This is what it's about. It fundamentally goes back to the need to understand the religious ideology. They do believe that they are ushering in an apocalyptic era where the Jews will be wiped off the face of the earth. Israel will be no more, essentially. There's going to be the 12th Imam, and you get into Islamic eschatology, and it gets very, very dark.
And it's extremist ideology.
Extremist.
It's absolute extreme. And also the likes of the previous president, Ahmadinejad, felt that they needed nuclear weapons in order to trigger a nuclear war with Israel, in order to bring about the return of the 12th Imam or the Islamic Mahdi. So it just shows you the mindset of these people is incredibly extreme. Now, I'm just going to read you a quick editorial from the Sunday Telegraph. It says, a terrible idea when Barack Obama cooked up. It gave Tehran cash, yet did not stop the development of missile technology. To revive it now would be a breath of contempt. Sunset clauses would take effect after a few years, while the regime could pocket billions in sanctions relief, meaning the regime would still have nuclear weapons even if we entered into a nuclear agreement. This might actually rescue the mullahs at the very moment when courageous Iranian dissidents are risking and losing their lives to challenge it. Despite this, the EU diplomats have insisted that the nuclear deal be revived. This is dangerously stupid. Britain should have nothing to do with it. Even the ultra-liberal Biden administration was reportedly wary of taking Europe's advice. After all, it's just accused Iran of providing hundreds of drones to Russia. It is obvious that Tehran and Moscow represents an axis of authoritarianism at a time has come for the West to acknowledge the scale of the threat posed by Iran to its neighbours and to its own people. The good news is that the UK is clearly much cooler on the deal now than it used to be on this issue. We're finally breaking from EU's policy. The same energy and unity that has been applied to containing Putin should now be applied to Iran before it's too late. And I think that sums it up very well. We need to wake up to the dangers posed by the Islamic Republic of Iran to Britain and also the West. What are your closing thoughts, Reagan?
I fully agree with that, Simon. We have had many, many years of opportunity to understand this growing threat. There has to be something beyond words at some point. When we get to that point, I'm not certain, and it's not really mine to say, but I think there is clearly enough evidence to be planning. There should be some, definitely, we need to be proactive, not reactive. We're on the back foot when we're reactive. We need to be proactively thinking through action that could be even offensive to some degree, that could see this evil regime overthrown and the nations under threat aided and protected.
Absolutely, and also what we're seeing lacking from our British government is moral clarity. Standing up for this regime and understanding what evil is. And unfortunately, this day and age we're living in, our nations and our society, morality has become blurred. We don't no longer know what is good and evil. And so therefore we turned a blind eye to the most dangerous regime in the world.
Iran gets the ability to go to the World Cup and various sporting events. Russia doesn't. The two walk hand in hand, right? So even on that basis, we need to acknowledge sanctions need to be levied and stuck to.
Reagan, thanks. It's been a pleasure doing Behind the Headlines with you. I want to thank you for watching this program tonight. We need to continue to pray and intercede for the Iranian people in their struggle against the Iranian regime. We've outlined how the Iranian regime is posing not only a threat to Israel, Europe, but also the United Kingdom. And it's vital that we pray for our security and for our government to deal with this threat. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Behind the Headlines.